I'm sure you're super excited about this lecture, but I'm going to try to convince you that theory is important and that the theories that we study in this class are worth knowing. So let's see if I'm successful. In our daily lives, we are theorizing all of the time, and whether we know it or not, and each theory that we're using offers a different explanation for the same reality. Basically, theorizing is putting into words why we think something is happening and then testing to see if it's right or not. All researchers and helping professionals have theories they are operating from, whether or not they're aware of them, whether or not they can articulate them. So my original attitude towards these family theories was that they were totally boring. I had to take a class on them in my master's program, and I did not see the point. I really wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty of what to say, what to do in therapy, and this seemed way too abstract. And in fact, when I went to a doctoral program, I was supposed to take family theory again, and I really tried to get out of it because I was like, I've already taken it, and it was terrible. But the instructor made me write a theoretical paper on my area of interest in place of taking the class again, and that actually turned me around to the importance of theory. So here's a few things that are useful about theory. They help with the accumulation of knowledge. We have an explosion of research on lots of phenomena in our field, and using kind of a theoretical framework helps organize the research findings. It also is a part of joining the academic conversation about a topic. But also, when you are trying to help people or study people, there are so many data points coming at you, both kind of verbal and nonverbal, physiological, and you could just really easily be overwhelmed if you don't have a guiding theoretical framework. It helps you basically keep your head above water, and when you're a helping professional, figure out how to help. In terms of precision and guidance, thinking theoretically forces us to be more precise about why we think these things are related, or what else should we be studying. I learned this the hard way. I had done a master's thesis on a couple of different topics in the world of emotional and physical labor and the type of job that you had. Really interesting, but I never grounded it in theory, and I really had a hard time getting it published afterwards. And then the theory also helps with that explanation or interpretation, the why or the how. And each theory basically interprets situations in different ways. So we can apply different theories to a situation and figure out what's the best fit, or what's missing. And this will become a little bit more clear on this next slide. Okay, so my daughter Iris is older now, but when she was in middle school, she went through a period where she was pretty much a cage of rage. And so at one point I took the theories that we use in this class, and I applied them to try to better understand, what might be happening for her. And each of the theories that we study in this class would explain kind of a really angry teenage girl in a slightly different way. Family systems theory, for example, might guide us to look at, what are the rules and the roles in our family? Are they perhaps outdated? Are we being too strict about bedtime or screen time? Or is she, for example, being scapegoated? Are we making her out to be the problem kid so that we can kind of join together and feel better about ourselves? In terms of life course perspective, we could say, okay, she's in a huge transition, both, academically and physically, going through puberty. And what we know is that during times of transition, people are temporarily dysregulated. But we can look at their trajectory, which is another life course term, and see that, she did pretty well in adjusting to elementary school and starting middle school, and so she's probably going to adjust to these transitions too. Family stress would help us maybe look at what are the coping skills or the resources that she has, and what else might she need. Social exchange would look at kind of the pros and cons, rewards and costs of her situation, and maybe things are unfair in our family to her. She's a helper. I can easily ask her more quickly to help than I do my son, for example, because he readily says yes and he generally says no, but then reluctantly helps. And so perhaps she's just being overburdened, and we need to examine the fairness of her situation in the family. In terms of feminist, now that she's coming into a woman's body, she is being looked at differently. And she came home in middle school one day and said, oh my gosh, I was riding my bike across the crosswalk with this other older woman, this woman who was older than me, and this man went past us and said, "Hello, ladies," kind of in this leering way. And suddenly she just felt, like she'd never felt before, that she felt less safe, she felt more like objectified. And so, yeah, that could be happening too. Attachment theory, which we'll be studying later in the semester, would say, during times of transition and stress, we all need to feel valued, like we matter, like we're seen, like we're visible, and we need to feel connected to our people. And so maybe that's missing for her, some of that sense of attachment security. I don't know if you've wondered this as you've learned theories in other classes, like Bromper-Brenner and Piaget and Vygotsky, family systems. Why is it that we just can't have one big theory? Why do we have to have all these different theories? I was always frustrated by that. And I think the reason why is that we just, we don't is because we aren't that smart yet in terms of being reflective about human systems. We're just too complicated to boil it down to one theory as of now. But as we get into some of these theories, you'll notice that many of them have borrowed from each other because they realized they weren't kind of explaining things as well, and so they took something from another theory to try to explain things better. So like I mentioned, we are theorizing all of the time. Why am I so tired? Why am I in such a good mood? Why is my boyfriend or my girlfriend cranky? Why does my curly hair look terrible today or great today? But scientific theories, of course, are a specific form of theory that's more testable. That's one reason why, for example, Freud's theory in developmental studies is not as in favor, because it wasn't as testable. It was difficult to test the id, the ego, and the superego. Or how do you test denial? Like, you're in denial. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. You're in denial that you're in denial, right? It gets a little tricky. So all scientific theories have these components: assumptions, concepts, propositions, and relations, which I'll describe more on the next slides. Okay, so assumptions are basically, as you can see in my little picture there, the foundation of a theory. It's what the theory is built upon. It's sort of taken for granted. Sometimes these can be tested, and sometimes these are just basic and underlying belief of the theory. And so you'll notice as we get into these theories that we'll have assumptions for each theory as part of the PowerPoint. All right, so let me give you some examples for the theories that we are studying in this class. So from family systems theory, one of the basic underlying beliefs is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For family development, it's that families, like individuals, should be viewed over time. For family stress, it would be that there's some characteristics of stressor events which can influence how that stressor event affects a family. An assumption from social exchange theory is that people are motivated by self-interest. From feminist theory, it's that gender is a socially constructed concept. And from attachment theory, a basic underlying assumption, that often goes on, it's hard to test, is just that we all need other people. Concepts are abstractions. So a concept stands for basically a class of ideas or things. They help us organize the phenomenon, and we try to, and kind of have a consistent language. We try not to invent a new concept every time we're trying to describe an event, because then it's hard to build on the work of others if everyone is calling it, something different. So researchers try to get as specific as possible and come to some consensus on what these things mean. So one example is that there was a period of time in the marriage research where people, this was decades ago now, that people were confusing marital satisfaction and marital stability. They were using the terms interchangeably. But then there became some kind of significant research papers in the literature that said, nope, marital satisfaction is about how happy a couple is, and marital stability is how likely it is that they're going to stay together or get a divorce. Because as we know, people can be unhappy, but for example, not getting a divorce. So we're trying to get more consistent about concepts. And then variables is how the concept is operationalized in a research study. Or maybe in a helping situation. So there's lots of debate over, how to operationalize concept and which measures are best. But interestingly, when you're reading a research study, if the concept, the words that they're using aren't familiar and you're not sure what they mean, or they're thinking about it in the same way that you do, you can go look at the measures to see how they are operationalizing or measuring the idea. So for example, in my master's thesis, I was interested in the concept of household labor. There were tons of studies with household labor in the title, but interestingly, they measured them in household labor in really different ways. So some people were looking at what's your in a couple, what's your percentage of household labor? Others were looking at how many hours exactly are you spending on household labor per week? Others were looking at what's your perception of the fairness of your household labor. So the concept of household labor was the same, but the variables were different depending upon the research studies. And I had to find the ones that were thinking about it in the same way that I was. So relations are like the verbs in a theory. And in order to relate concepts, which are the nouns, to each other, we need kind of connecting relations or verbs to tell us how these concepts are related. And once we link up some concepts in a meaningful way with relations, then we create theoretical propositions. So here's an example of one developed from feminist theory. The social class of the husband is positively related to the amount of household labor that he performs. So basically, the more money he makes, the more household labor he does. Interestingly, as an aside, that's actually a curvilinear relationship. So husbands perform more household labor as their income rises until a certain point, and then it begins to go down again. So in this theoretical proposition, the concepts are your social class, status, and housework. And the relation is positively, meaning that as one goes up, the other goes up. Obviously, we could have a negative relationship, or we could say that there's no relationship. So if you're testing yourself on this, families should be viewed over time. This is an example of a theoretical assumption, an underlying belief about a theory. So again, our theories should be empirically testable. Not all aspects of our theories have been tested, but the idea is that they should be able to be tested. So what we can do is take one theoretical proposition, and we'll get more into examples for each of our theories of what those are in upcoming lectures. But you select one proposition, and that becomes your conceptual or research hypothesis. So you take that proposition, families who have been successful at one stage are more likely to be successful at the next stage. That's from life course perspective. And then the research hypothesis might be that partners' relationship satisfaction prior to the birth of their first child will predict how depressed they are 1 year following the birth of that child. So again, we have to be able to measure the concepts by turning them into a variable, like a scale score, like the amount of depression that you feel, or a dyadic measure of relationship happiness. And then we have to be able to operationalize the relationship, like a mathematical model of linear regression or a correlation, to see how they might be related. All right, so if you're testing yourself on this, marital satisfaction is a theoretical concept, and once operationalized by a marital satisfaction scale, it becomes a variable. All right, so theory building is an ongoing part of theories, and it has two different kind of processes. One is deductive application, and one is basically an inductive process or inductive reasoning. So when we are using deductive reasoning, we basically apply the theory to a phenomenon. If this theory is correct, then we should see that these two things are correlated. And so we can kind of test out if this theory applies to this situation. Inductively is how can we observe things and then build a framework for what we are observing. Many qualitative research studies, for example, are inductive. You're interviewing people about something, like how they divide up household labor, and you're starting to build a theory about that. But if we, for example, took the study on the previous slide about how marital satisfaction between a couple prior to the birth of the first child predicts depression in each individual after the birth of the first child, what we're basically doing is first deductively applying life course perspective. We're saying, if this theory is true, then we should see that relationship satisfaction prior to the birth is correlated to lower rates of depression after birth. Let's say we test that out and we find that yes, that's the finding that we get, but it's only correlated for women in heterosexual couples. It's not correlated for men. So why might that be? And at this point in time, maybe life course perspective doesn't really have anything in its theory that would explain that gender difference. And so now we could go into an inductive process. We could say, okay, so the theory, life course perspective, was explained well for women, but not for men. And so what else could be happening that might help explain this? And maybe we interview couples and, men and women to kind of understand this experience. And maybe we pull a little bit on feminist theoretical frameworks to kind of inductively kind of add on to life course perspective, to expand life course perspective, to change it or amend it so that it could better explain the data. So that would just be an example of how you start deductively, and then when it's not totally fitting, you might move towards an inductive process. You can also, though, just start inductively, especially if a phenomenon hasn't really been researched before and there aren't good theories to explain it. All right, let's talk about this concept of postmodernism. When I started a PhD program, my very first day in class, I think, the woman sitting next to me kind of made this offhand comment about how we were such a postmodern program here at Purdue. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so clearly I don't belong here, It's a hard concept to explain. And I hope that as we talk this through, you'll be thinking about how would you explain postmodernism to somebody. So to understand postmodernism, we first have to understand what came before it, which was the positivist or modernist way of thinking, which was up until about the 1950s. And for this, we used to think that truth was basically like a diamond out there that scientists would go out and they'd dig it up and they'd find it and they'd hold it up and everybody would agree that it was a diamond and it would stay a diamond forever. And it was truth, right? Unchanging and universal. We really thought that we could truly know reality and discover objective truths about families. We also thought that we could be value neutral, that we wouldn't be biased as scientists and our biases wouldn't influence our research findings. And we could come up with basically universal rules that applied to all individuals and families. But what began to happen in the 1960s, the whole kind of question authority movement of the 1960s, was that maybe we weren't so kind of absolute, maybe we weren't so right. Maybe things did change. Maybe there's things all around us that we can't necessarily see until we have the words to describe it, until we know to look for it. So for example, when people first started studying divorce a lot in the 1970s and 80s, they were assuming that divorce was bad for kids. And so they were only looking for negative findings for negative effects of divorce on kids. And they found that. But decades later, when they began to realize that divorce could also be good for kids, they went back to some of those older studies and found that, yes, actually, you could find evidence that divorce was good for kids too, but nobody wrote about that because that wasn't the framework that they were operating from. They didn't know to even look for those good findings. So, for example, we started off thinking about stress like stress is bad, but now that we have actually begun to question that, we realize that stress can be good too. It has some positive effects on us. We used to not have all the names we have now for forms of abuse, which made it harder to even see and name and discuss the topic. So again, we can only see what we have paradigms for, and this is why I love kind of some of the terms that have emerged in our just general society, but also in our field that help us see concepts that we couldn't see before, like mansplaining or gaslighting or non-binary or implicit bias, right? Things that we didn't even know before because we didn't have words for them. So I have a snorkel mask here, and you might be wondering, like, why do I have this picture on the slide? And so the snorkel mask, in my mind, represents our existing schemas, our biases, our lenses, which limit what we can see or what we can know. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Florida, and I was definitely a scared snorkeler. And the reason why was because we'd jump in the water off the boat, and it seemed like it was all peaceful. You're looking through your snorkel mask. It's just kind of empty blue water. You're floating along. And then suddenly you turn your head, and there's a barracuda, like right there next to you. And that barracuda has been there the whole time, right? But your snorkel mask was preventing you from seeing it. And so I think of the snorkel mask as like our biases or our lenses or our schemas. And modernism was basically not even realizing that we all have snorkel masks on. And postmodernism is realizing that we're all wearing snorkel masks, and we need to try to figure out what those are and articulate them.